Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Depends on which part of the world you are tuning in from. My name is Helene Li. I'm the co-founder of GoImpact, and also we do a series of very interesting video casts with a lot of industry leaders. And today I'm very pleased to have with me in the room one of the brightest minds in the crypto space, Mr. Andrew Leelarthaepin, the Managing Director for Bitstamp in Asia Pacific. And as you know, Bitstamp is one of the leading crypto exchanges around the world. And when we have someone like Andrew in the room, I really want to pick his brains on what is going to happen now and next, that crypto is not just on the sidelines, but going mainstream. So Andrew, thank you for joining us today. I'd like to just start off with some of the regulatory trends that has really been a tailwind pushing this, in much more forefront and center stage, particularly with the institutional investors. What do you see as happening with that momentum, globally, as well as in Asia Pacific, Andrew?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Helene. It was a pleasure to speak with you today. And likewise, I think it's definitely always good to to listen to yourself, because you always have a lot of interesting things to say. I guess like in terms of 2022, what we've seen so far in the first quarter in terms of like institutional participation. We've seen already billions of dollars of fundraising by blockchain related businesses. And I think this could be a suggestion that, 2022 is on track to beat 2021. 2021, record setting trends in terms of like PE and VC and institutional investment into the broader crypto space. And, I see this as more than just valuation, right? I see this as validation of an increasing role that blockchain will play in the financial services industry. We expect cryptocurrencies to play an even bigger structural role, not just in financial markets, but also facilitating payments, remittances, and powering this metaverse ecosystem, which is developing at a very sort of like rapid pace.
Yeah, absolutely. I think metaverse is something that is staring at us from all different directions, from the practicality of adoption, like you said, payments, to creative ways of, engaging with more customers, like the NFT and all these other, initiatives that is happening in the metaverse. Now, is the regulatory criteria, particularly homing into Hong Kong and maybe Singapore, been a tailwind in that? Because there has been talks about like it's only good for accredited investors and all that. And so how do you actually see that as building trust and confidence, Andrew?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, regulation is super important, right? Regulation is an important trend, not only in our region, but also just across the globe. And I think it's an important signaling for financial institutions in how they participate in digital assets. Because as we both know, financial institutions are well accustomed to operating within rule-based systems that the regulators have set, right? So I think, Singapore's moved early in terms of regulations pertaining to digital assets. And we see that Hong Kong is going to put out, rules into law in the coming months. So I've been told. And similarly, Australia, which is also an important market for us in the region, that's also started on its own regulatory path. Essentially, I see that, when we have better defined regulatory environments, this leads to more participation from traditional financial institutions. And that goes downstream, and, that essentially means that at some point, adoption from more mainstream participants, retail participants, starts to emerge as well. Right. So I definitely see this as positive signs. Obviously, like, you know, how they shape crypto markets is interesting, but I see that you know, this does lead to mainstream participation, because you do need that sort of like you do need that regulatory framework and that layer in between. You do need that customer protection, but you know, ultimately, you know, increased participation means greater market maturity, and with greater market maturity, like, you know, allows us to develop from an institutional standpoint a lot of like investment strategies that might not be available today.
Yeah, 100%. I think a lot of investor sentiments are tied to, as we say, trust and confidence, right? And people relate to that from, you know, a kind of regulated, I know that, you know, there are rules, you know, in play and so on, so that we know exactly how it's going to operate. You know, so I think having that level of comfort, I think is important. And ultimately from institutional investors, when that moves further downstream to the retail investors, as you said, the market maturity is going to benefit the whole crypto space, no matter at which end of the spectrum you are playing in. Now, what I'd like to do now is to hone in a little bit more, since we're both, you know, in Singapore and in Asia Pacific. So taking a closer pulse check, what are your clients in this part of the world saying to you? How do you feel the investor sentiment has been around this, Andrew?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess like ultimately, like to your point, like building trust and confidence amongst institutional investors is critical. And I think, like, you know, just to sort of, you know, step back and talk about it from a Bitstamp perspective, like one of our key things is we aim to be the most trusted marketplace for digital assets. And I think that kind of, you know, that kind of is shown through us, like, you know, as a global exchange, actively working with regulators in multiple jurisdictions across the globe. So, you know, we engage and we have relationships with regulators in Europe, in the US, and also very much here in Singapore as well. So, you know, from the Bitstamp perspective, we welcome regulation, because we ourselves pride ourselves on being compliance forward, right? So I think, like, you know, talking more about, like, you know, our own backyard, I think what's important to note is that the development of the regulations in our key markets is that process has been transparent, it has been consultative, right? So I guess Hong Kong has been publishing position papers and consultations in the recent years as they build towards solidifying the rules and putting some of those in order. And I think there's a clear indication from what we see in Hong Kong is that, you know, trading cryptocurrencies is likely to be restricted, at least initially, to professional and institutional investors. But ultimately, this won't foreclose, like, you know, investing in digital assets for retail, because, you know, at some point in time, we'll see them go mainstream and being offered by banks, and that goes downstream towards retail. I think, like, you know, Singapore's like decision to sort of curtail advertising on cryptocurrency, that came around the same time as a number of countries look to strengthen their rules on crypto advertising. Wasn't such an issue for us at Bitstamp, because, you know, our go-to-market approach has always had a strong institutional focus in APAC in particular. So that doesn't really sort of like affect us in that same way. But then I guess back to our clients, like, you know, our clients want to work with us because we have a reputation of being compliant forward. We have that institutional grade technology. We've got the deep roots and heritage, and, you know, we've been in the marketplace longer than anyone else as a crypto exchange. So, you know, that, you know, we understand that, you know, there are very many different client segments in the institutional space, but like, what we do helps them to meet their sort of requirements. Yeah, so I think, going back to, honing in on your question, I think, a lot of the institutional client segment, they recognize that regulations are a natural part of their existing business today, right? So it's just a natural sort of flow on effect that at some point the digital assets will be regulated in a similar sort of manner. And so, for those clients, I think they see that as kind of natural, and they are definitely at a point in time now that they're very much, on the sidelines, but they're on the sidelines waiting to sort of like get into the space. And I see this as something that, just keeps developing like very, very rapidly, because I'm seeing interest from, not only your traditional financial markets, but also like, in the region, pension funds, sovereign funds, exchanges. So like, that sort of segment and that interest keeps growing.
100%. I think, Andrew, what you touch on is really interesting as we want to take a slight look forward. I know none of us have a crystal ball, so I'm not pretending to hold one in our hands at all in the room today. But I think what you just mentioned about, a broadening segment from the institutional clients, taking active interest in this, if even people like pension funds, sovereign wealth funds that you would have thought would be a little bit slower in terms of coming on to, a different type of investment vehicle. What do you see as being needed for, for Bitstamp or for companies in the crypto space to be ready for this in the near term future?
Yeah, well, I think really if you sort of narrow it down to a couple of things, right? So one, I see that user experience has to be as seamless as any sort of other interaction that everyone has now on a day-to-day basis, whether it is through their mobile applications, whether it's through online e-commerce portals. There's a certain there's a certain standard now that we sort of have in terms of all our digital interactions. And so that's one, right? And I'm sort of just just brainstorming off the top of my head here. But then the second thing is that there also has to be a reason why someone would engage in digital assets, i.e. there has to be a benefit over and above what people are engaging with today. So if it's in terms of a savings or an investment sort of play, then if digital assets are able to give you a yield over and above what you would have from traditional financial market products, then that is, in this instance, one case of it being something that I would look to use, right? So there has to be a benefit over what they'll be doing today. And then I think thirdly, the regulatory thing, and that, that sort of encompasses all of that, because that brings about the whole safety, trust, transparency, and ultimately accountability for all of us who are participants in this industry. And that sort of gives that sort of accountability and transparency to the broader sort of consumer space. So I think there's a couple of key elements, but one is the user experience has to be top notch, right? So it has to be something that's just as simple as and easy as anything that anyone else deals with today from a digital perspective. Two, it has to have a benefit to the end user, right? So whatever that is, so maybe simplified ways of payment, faster and cheaper ways of payment, or as I touched on earlier, the ability to generate yield at a much better level than you would, say, with your money sitting in a bank. And then thirdly, the whole sort of regulatory thing wrapping around it. And so ultimately bringing to the marketplace, there are trusted and transparent firms that you can deal with, right? And Bitstamp obviously highlighting that element of trust.
I couldn't agree more. And I think part of what crypto assets is doing to the whole capital market space is that it democratize the access for everyone. So I think there's an increasing demand for that. So that I'm sure this is, at the top of mind of the regulators, seeing this as a benefit to democratize that access. And again, in order to do so, you need to be transparent. You need to build up that level of trust and confidence across the investor base as well. Any final words of wisdom, Andrew, that you would like to leave with the audience, be they institutional investors, or maybe there are a few private investors, in the room, listening to this as well?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I don't have a crystal ball with respect to all of this. However, when it comes to regulations, ultimately, I see that at some point in time, we're going to get, we're going to be moving in the right direction. I mean, regulations are there in place of are there for security reasons and compliance reasons. And I think ultimately, that's going to be part of this layer that makes digital assets really go mainstream. So I think for any sort of institutional participants who want to sort of get into the space, Bitstamp has had the experience of dealing on the exchange space for over 10 years now. We pride ourselves on being very compliance forward, and we're able to sort of engage as a one-stop shop for institutions to get involved into the crypto space.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I think everyone that have caught, this, we are very lucky to have shared a lot of insights from Andrew Leelarthaepin, the Managing Director of Bitstamp in Asia Pacific. Thank you very much for tuning in.